All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 29 or Chapter 30, depending on what edition of the textbook that you have. Revolutions in Living, 1900 and 1950. We'll be looking at Section 1, New Technology Outside the Industrialized World. So the industrialized world, we're mainly referring to parts of Europe, not all of Europe, but especially Northern and Western Europe, Great Britain, Germany, France, countries like that. The United States, and Japan. But really Japan after, let's say after about 1870-ish. So we're looking here about the impact of various technologies in places other than, right, outside. So not Europe, not United States, and not Japan. So urbanization was something that impacted industrialized nations first. So again, we want to say that industrialization caused urbanization. In the year 1900, most of the population centers were in Europe. So for example, in the year 1900, London was the world's largest city. By the 1950s, it had changed some. There were beginning to be more and more cities outside of Europe that surpassed European cities in terms of population. One of them was New York in the United States. Again, still an industrial nation. But the trend to today was drifting more towards China and India. So in terms of the process of urbanization, again, think of cities, especially those that are very populated. Initially, the Industrial Revolution made European cities the most populated in the world. Then that began to kind of transfer to other areas around the world, including the United States. And today, we're mostly looking at China and what your textbook refers to as South Asia. South Asia is just another word for India, which today are the most populated cities there. In the industrialized world, technologies that kind of impacted, those particular cities included things like, railroads, subways, things like skyscrapers. However, outside the industrial world, a good example that your textbook talks about is the rickshaw. And if you're not familiar with what a rickshaw is, it's let's see if I can draw a rickshaw. It's a sort of cart that a person carries, right? So they're holding on to this, and then, somebody sits in the back of it, and they run throughout the streets. You didn't really see this too much in the industrialized world. The rickshaw was likely to originate in Japan, but was then spread pretty quickly to other parts around the world. So in terms of a new technology outside of the industrial world, we would point to the rickshaw as one of those examples. Another technology that had a slightly different impact in the non-industrial world was electricity. For the most part, electricity was available in the industrial world. Not so much in other places. And so this appliance-oriented lifestyle that characterized Europe and the United States, and to a lesser degree Japan, did not take hold, at least not in this period, right, 1900 to 1950, did not take hold. Instead, you were much more likely to see appliances and technologies that did not utilize electricity. A good example is the foot-powered sewing machine, where you use your foot to go up, you push a pedal on your foot up and down, whereas in the industrialized world, you're much more likely to find electricity. One of the reasons was because electricity required a lot of infrastructure to create, and it needed a consumer base that could pay for a type of like subscription, pretty much, when you think about it. And in a lot of parts outside the industrialized world, there wasn't a consumer class large enough that could readily make economic sense to build entire electric grids. Eventually, after the 1950s, we can talk more about how some of these technologies spread. But in this period, again, that might be a difference there. In terms of media, there were two big developments: motion pictures, aka movies, and photography. Photography in the 1820s got some of its origins. I probably won't be pronouncing this person's or these people's names correctly, but Auguste and Louis Lumière, these were French inventors of what they called motion pictures. And their invention was roughly 1895. Movies were utilized in the industrial world and non-industrial world. One thing that's true about both motion pictures and photography, and we'll say this about both of them, is both used outside the industrial world. This is a picture of the very first kind of pioneering motion picture device, but with some, some differences, right? So, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, who we'll talk about more in India, became very popular for various news films of him. Gandhi was somebody who certainly utilized the new technology of motion pictures and movies to spread his message and popularity. Photography was quickly adopted in all sorts of parts of the world. One example of how it kind of blended with culture was, for example, in the Islamic world, there was, you might say, hesitation, maybe prohibition of capturing people when it came to photography, especially by some of the more traditional Muslim clerics. It was forbidden to take pictures of other people, but that didn't stop a lot of Muslim photographers from taking pictures of other things. This was especially true when it came to populations with illiterate or places where illiteracy. Photography was in some ways a substitute for literacy. Not everybody could read, but everybody could view pictures, and this was especially true when it came to themes regarding like national identity and nationalism outside of the industrialized world.